to avoid misusing the money or something. So it's necessary to know exactly the proposal would fit with the what the money cost.
And we're going to come back to the money, because the money is what got everybody interested in the question of what is research misconduct. If there were all the money in the world, it would still be bad science to make up data.
I don't think so money justify the invasion of your privacy anyway.
Well, and the question of who pays for research, do they have an obligation beyond looking at how the money is spent to be sure that your science is good? Yes? All right, this is the first time I've ever heard scientists say people need to look at other people's science.
Not to look exactly at the people's size, but to make sure that the educated money has been used.
Okay, so put the money over here.
Yeah.
I don't know what science you're doing, but is there someone capable of reviewing your science and saying, this is good science, this is bad science? That should always be reviewing your work. Yes.
The panel who are looking at the proposal, even their research should be from the same field.
Should be something in the same field.
Study section.
Yeah, study sections and formal research. Yes.
In fact, ethical review also includes scientific review.
It should.
Yes.
But that's a debate also.
Yeah, therefore it is done with the ethical review, actually. Beyond that, I think it's not normal, but if it is initiated by the scientists, then it would be a possibility. You may ask your friends, or other people, or someone who knows the situation, and then you may go and get an advice, but no more than that.
So in the experience that I've heard here, and others both from this institute and others where I've worked in other countries, the systems are very different depending on how well established the research environment is, and also in terms of how the money is allocated for research. That to start a proposal, the proposal will be reviewed, but to start individual experiments within the proposal, there's not likely to be a review. So if there's a big change to the initial proposal for a grant, that may need to be reviewed, but on a day-to-day basis, what you're doing won't be. And ethics review is very common for human studies, but not necessarily for animal studies, and not necessarily for things that are just laboratory bench research. And then the question becomes, when do you move into an area that goes from bench to human? Where do we get the review there, and does it include both the science and the ethics? The Korean system didn't have much by way of review aside from clinical trials with human subjects. So Dr. Huang, moving from animals and stem cells and laboratory environment to human subjects and human oocytes, was in this gray area where there was no clear review either of the science, which was groundbreaking science, or of the ethics. So having the question of review, and this was a really important conversation. We have a couple of other things we want to pull out, and several other people with hands. Yes.
But I think in this study, the researcher takes some material from human body. So it requires ethic review. There is no gray area.
So there is no gray area once you get to the humans, but he started with animals. He started with dogs. And some of the misconduct occurred with the area of dogs and no review.
But also, if it is searched in ethics committee, if it is reviewed about the eggs, this process should comprise of all terms to take the eggs and
absolutely.
use the eggs also.
It should. It should. By the time we get to humans, there's no gray area. But when we get to the place where there's no gray area, there's a lot of gray. No review for animals, no review for bench research. When we start taking eggs is when there needed to be something done, but it was not well regulated in the Korean system.
How many ethics? How many ethics review review boards were worked in the study? Maybe 2 ethics board.
There were none.
No, none.
There were none.
No.
None. Before there was law. And part of the challenge of this case is that new science creates new questions for policy also. And before, how many of you were working before there was an ethics committee in your country? A human research ethics committee? What did you do before there was a human research ethics committee? Nothing. And you hoped that everybody was ethical, and maybe you looked to Declaration of Helsinki. But new questions, and that's our next slide, new questions in science, we probably should. We'll come back to the scientific
But he
questions.
had a question.
Sorry.
It was not a question either. Ethical review has, in my view, 2 dimensions. One is related to the content of the subject, and secondly, knowledge. So that is one, whether that part of science, whether those types of studies are allowed or not, whether we
Yes.
support them. Secondly, even if that's support with methodology, the way we use people, animals, whether we pay those or not, all those relations should be also clarified. So these 2 levels of ethical review, the rules should be laid down in the beginning so everyone knows. The whole question is whether to put practical checkup, control, what individual study is.
To monitor over
To
time.
monitor whether we do it in the beginning, whether we do it at the end, before it goes to publication, that can be the
And there is internationally a lot of debate about where scientific review falls, where it should fit in the ethics review. Some countries have separate committees that first review the science and then review the ethics. In our country, the
Separate
department,
committees. Separate committees.
separate committees. In our country, the IRB, the Research Ethics Committee, expects that the department head will have already said this is scientifically sound. Sometimes the department head reads carefully. Sometimes the department head doesn't know the specifics of the science. And so we also have biostatistical review, more important than the scientific review in some cases.
So would you like to take this point in
So,
the department?
The department head reviews and has to sign off on the science. And there is no separate committee.
Actually, there is a scientific committee.
We have no scientific
We
committee.
have a
You have scientific committee.
Well,
And you have scientific.
The science gets reviewed at the point where you apply for funding. That's what
Right.
For in the United
But
States,
for the
right?
research ethics
And in
committee.
Europe, in the European Union, it's the same thing. So assuming that most of us do not have private money on the side and we have to get money by applying through our governments, the applications, which are based on science, those are reviewed before grant money is allocated. And that is basically a scientific review.
Yeah, actually, in our country, when you want to any research, we present it to the scientific committee. If she approve it, then the team or person he can make it for promotion. If not, he will not allow to
To do it.
The promotion,
Yeah,
yes,
that's
yes,
promotion.
yes. Okay, please, shall I move?
So if we can move to, we've entered into already the discussion of the fact that the focus early on how the money was spent was on a term that is widely used for financial misdoings, wrongdoings, and that's fraud. The word fraud showed up many, many times. We still use it from time to time about saying you're doing one thing, but actually doing something else, lying about your work. the idea that fraud carried implications of money made a lot of people in science concerned that they were missing the point. It wasn't about the money, it was about the quality of the science. Was the science good no matter who paid for it? And so, in English at least, there was a refocusing of the term away from fraud to this notion of misconduct. And we'd like to introduce in the next session, next piece of the session, the question of what falls into the area of misconduct in research. This is an issue that, depending on the language that you speak, there may be a lot of different terms. Go back one more. Back, yeah. When we talk about good practice, many people were talking about ethical research. But bench scientists were quick to point out that ethics is a term that has already been used so much for human subjects research that it confused the situation. Many people in the laboratory said, ethics, bioethics, that's medical research, that's not us. And so the term integrity was selected in English by many people as the term to use to reflect on better practices in science that have ethical aspects. This definition is not one that is used all around the world. Integrity, as we talked about a little bit in our group yesterday, integrity is a word that is very hard to define because it's so broad. Are you all comfortable with the term integrity? Is there a translation into Arabic or into French or into Turkish that you're comfortable with the word integrity?
Actually, it is known that this is a very difficult word to translate in many languages.
It is. And in the Scandinavian countries, they don't have a word for integrity. They say ethics.
In many places.
And to say ethics is to open all these other questions. But integrity comes back, in the scientific sense, to the truthfulness of the data and all the things that go into that. So we talk about the integrity of the data. Are they reproducible? What we'd like to look at for a few minutes is to look at the question of what sort of poor scientific practices might we consider to be forms of misconduct. Poor scientific practice that have ethical consequences. And if you can spend 7 minutes identifying things like what you talked about with Huang and his studies. What if we were to say these are scientific misbehaviors where we want to be sure our students learn not to do them and why they're bad and why if we saw them in a colleague's research we'd be worried. Does that make sense?